95 years old and legally blind? To Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, those were petty details. He'd struck a bargain, and he was here to claim his prize. As the old man leapt from his galley into the surf, a sea of knights followed, crosses emblazoned across their chest. But they weren't charging the infidel. They were moving against the direct orders of the Pope, in opposition to sacred vows, and toward the walls of Christendom's most spectacular city. Hello, and welcome to Impactful Moments, where we explore some of the most, you guessed it, impactful moments in human history. In this video, we'll discuss the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, one of Christianity's darkest hours. It started much like the others. Jerusalem was in Muslim hands, and the Pope had called for the nobles of Europe to rise up and fight for God. But this time would be different. Let's take a quick step back. When the rising Islamic force of the Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Eastern Roman Empire was plunged into civil war, allowing Turkish tribes to swallow much of Anatolia. When Alexios I Komnenos finally stabilized the Byzantine throne, the enemy was practically at the capital's doorstep. Desperate, Komnenos turned to Pope Urban II, requesting mercenaries to reclaim lost Roman soil. But the Pope saw a different opportunity. Rather than acting as a supporting cast for the Byzantines, he rallied the nobles of Europe behind a holier ambition, the liberation of Jerusalem. The First Crusade, brutal, chaotic, but ultimately successful, created fragile Crusader states in the Levant, and sparked decades of on and off conflict with the surrounding Muslim forces. By 1187, the tide had turned again. The legendary Saladin had united the Middle Eastern Muslim world and recaptured Jerusalem, and despite the heroics of Richard the Lionheart in the Third Crusade, the city remained in Muslim hands. In 1198, Pope Innocent III ascended to the papal throne with one familiar, overriding obsession: Jerusalem. He issued Post Miserabile, a new call to arms, and while Europe answered, it was with distraction and division. The Holy Roman Empire was wrapped in a fierce succession struggle. The kings of England and France, meanwhile, were too busy fighting each other over the crumbling continental territories of the ineffectual King John to commit to an overseas war. Without the backing of Europe's great monarchs, the crusade fell instead to powerful nobles: Louis of Blois, Baldwin of Flanders, and Thibault of Champagne. But the latter died in 1201 before the crusade was underway, and was eventually replaced by the wealthy Italian Boniface of Montferrat, who was to lead the forces. It was an army of mostly French knights led by an Italian marquis rather than a king, and, more dangerously, a mission without a logistical plan. Enter Venice. By 1200, the Venetian Republic was less a city and more a floating empire, growing rich off of the trade routes that connected Europe to the eastern Mediterranean. When the Crusader leaders decided to strike directly at the Ayyubid heartland in Egypt, they needed ships, and Venice was the only power that could provide them. After negotiation, the Venetians agreed to suspend their entire commercial economy for a year to build a fleet capable of carrying roughly 33,000 Crusaders. But this was not charity. Venice expected to be paid, and paid well. The crusade would launch from Venice, seize the Ayyubid heartland in Egypt, and only then march on Jerusalem. But the numbers didn't add up. When it came time to depart, only about 13,000 Crusaders actually arrived in Venice. Poor logistics and decentralized leadership meant the Crusaders were scattered across different ports, or simply stayed home. The fleet was ready, but the army was less than half of its expected size, and the Venetians, who had invested heavily, had no intention of letting the debt go unpaid. Enrico Dandolo, the Doge, or head of the Venetian state, was in his 90s and legally blind when he offered the Crusaders a devil's bargain. Venice would suspend the debt if the army helped them settle an old score. The target was Zara, a port city on the Adriatic coast that had broken away from Venetian control in 1181 to favor King Emmerich of Hungary. Venice would join the crusade, adding significant manpower, and the loot from Zara would cover the debt. Enticing as it was, Zara was a Christian city, whose king had even taken the Crusaders' vow, meaning his lands were under the protection of the church. The horrified pope threatened excommunication to anyone that attacked, but his warning either arrived late or was withheld from the assault's leadership. Zara initially surrendered, but a Crusader faction led by Simon de Montfort, who vehemently disagreed with the attack on Zara, convinced the citizens that the French wouldn't actually attack. The sabotage caused the surrender to collapse, enraging Dandolo, who forced the full army to fulfill its oath. In November 1202, in direct opposition to the papal order, the Christian port city was besieged and sacked. Furious, the Pope excommunicated the army, but eventually pardoned non-Venetians on the condition that they head straight for the Holy Land. That, to put it lightly, proved wishful thinking. Let's once again take a quick step back. The Crusades' new leader, the aforementioned Boniface of Montferrat, was closely connected with Philip of Swabia, the German king. Philip was the brother-in-law of Alexios IV Angelos, whose father Isaac had been ousted as the Byzantine emperor and blinded by his own brother Alexios III. The younger Alexios IV felt the throne should be his and was looking for an army to help him take it back. Boniface and Alexios developed a cordial relationship in Philip's court several years earlier, and it was now Alexios who would offer the Crusaders a new devil's bargain. To many in the Crusades' leadership, this offer seemed nothing short of miraculous. Repayment of the Venetian debt, 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 Byzantine soldiers, 20 additional ships, and perhaps most enticing of all, Alexios would move the Eastern Church back under papal authority. The catch? If attacking the Christian city of Zara was bad, attacking Constantinople was unthinkable. Externally, Pope Innocent III forbade the plan. After the disaster at Zara, he wanted nothing to do with a new diversion. However, beneath the hood, the Holy Grail prospect of mending the 150-year-old Great Schism likely gave him pause. Ultimately, while a few thousand rank-and-file soldiers abandoned the side quest, many followed their leaders to the gates of Constantinople, with or without the papal blessing. After a protracted yet failed Byzantine resistance, the Crusaders' siege and assault in July 1203 was a success. Sort of. The reigning Emperor Alexios III fled to Thrace with much of the city's treasury. The Byzantine officials reinstated the blind Isaac II to the throne, but the Crusaders refused to leave until their man, Alexios IV, was crowned co-emperor. The arrangement was doomed from the start. To the Greeks, Alexios IV was a traitorous puppet. To the Crusaders, he was a debtor with an empty treasury. Escalating riots soon turned deadly, and a series of fires, sparked by growing street violence, engulfed a significant portion of the city. The tension finally snapped in February 1204. Following the death of Isaac, a staunch anti-Latin nobleman, Alexios V, Mortziflos Ducas, seized power. He had the young Alexios IV strangled and flatly refused to honor the Crusaders' contract. As one might imagine, this did not sit particularly well. Despite desperate pleas from the Pope to refrain, the Crusaders, bankrupt, betrayed, and very, very angry, prepared for a second assault, and on April 12, 1204, the impossible happened. The Queen of Cities, which had resisted invaders for nearly 9 centuries, fell. What followed was 3 days of systematic horror. The Crusaders descended upon the city's palaces and churches, including the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, smashing the silver iconostases and riding horses through the sanctuary. They looted priceless Roman relics and Greek statues, many of which were melted down or shipped back to Venice. The destruction expanded beyond the material. The chronicler Nicetas Coniatus, an eyewitness, described the Crusaders as more savage than the Saracens, who, under leaders like Saladin, had shown mercy to the city of Jerusalem. As per historian Speros Vrionis, they, quote-unquote, murdered, raped, looted, and destroyed on a scale which even the ancient Vandals and Goths would have found unbelievable. By the time the fires died down, the once great Byzantine Empire was a hollowed-out shell, and the Crusaders, who had set out to fight for God, sat in the ruins of the world's most beautiful city, dividing its blood-soaked spoils among themselves. Not every crusader took part in the catastrophes at Zara and Constantinople. Some contingents had already splintered away, sailing directly to the Levant in siloed attempts to fulfill the mission's original purpose. But after April 1204, the Fourth Crusade was finished. Those who arrived in Acre were too few to secure the backing of King Aymery of Jerusalem, who refused to risk his truce with the Ayyubids for such a fractured force. The promised march on Jerusalem would never come. The consequences were regionally shattering. For the first time in 9 centuries, the Byzantine Empire effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a Latin Empire in Constantinople and Greek rump states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. This patchwork of rival regimes destabilized the Balkans and Anatolia for decades. Though the Byzantines reclaimed their capital in 1261, the restored empire was a hollowed-out shadow of its former self, permanently weakened and vulnerable. Amid the debacle, the clear winner was Venice. In the Partitio Terrarum Imperii Romaniae, the Republic secured 3/8 of the Byzantine world, gaining a string of strategic islands and ports, turning the Adriatic and Aegean into Venetian lakes. With this expansion, Venice exploded into its golden age, dominating Mediterranean trade and funneling the stolen wealth from the east back into its lagoons. While the Fourth Crusade may have failed miserably as a holy war, it remains one of the greatest commercial coups in history. The Byzantine decline was a centuries-long process, one many believe truly began at Manzikert in 1071. Yet, where Manzikert kick-started the descent, 1204 crippled the dying state. Even when the quote-unquote empire quote-unquote recovered in 1261, it merely began a 2-century limp to the finish line. The rise of the Bulgarian and Serbian powers in the Balkans and the Ottomans in Anatolia whittled Byzantine influence down to little more than a city-state long before its final fall in 1453. Perhaps even more devastating than this likely inevitable geopolitical collapse was the spiritual fallout. The events of 1204 exposed the Pope's direct orders as little more than suggestions. The threat of excommunication, which had once humbled emperors, now barely scared off a fraction of the army. And this came under Pope Innocent III, viewed by many as the most powerful pope in history, foreshadowing a looming papal decline, culminating in events like the Avignonese captivity, when the papacy fell under the thumb of the French crown. Even the concept of crusading itself lost coherence. Once a mission for the liberation of the Holy Land, it had become a political weapon, increasingly turned against fellow Christians, such as the brutal Albigensian Crusade just 5 years later. But the most lasting spiritual damage lay in the Crusade's deepest irony. While one of the stated goals in Constantinople was to reunite the schismatic churches, the result was the diametrical opposite. The Schism of 1054 had been a theological rupture, with politics sprinkled in. After 1204, however, that divide was sealed in blood. To the Orthodox world, the Latins were no longer estranged brothers, but betrayers, a resentment that hardened across generations. When the dust settled, the Fourth Crusade stood as a masterclass in achieving the precise opposite of its intended mission. The Muslims emerged stronger, the Church's authority had taken a major blow, and the unity of Christendom was shattered beyond repair. Many still regard those 3 days in 1204 as among the darkest in Christian history. I hope you enjoyed this video and found this period in history both informative and enlightening. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you can join us for another video. Thanks for watching.